So my presentation is on the history and evolution of video game controllers. So for over 3 decades, games have been going to looking like this, very basic. We thought this was revolutionary, and now we're getting stuff like that over there on the right, which is just crazy if you think about it. But there's something that we usually just kind of overlook and just pick it up and use it, and that's the controller. In that same time frame, we've gone from something that's just a joystick and a button to something that has even a touchpad on it that just creates so many new types of ways to play with the game. And so controllers have evolved throughout the years in an effort to adapt to the new styles of games. And you really see this as we need more buttons, we'll get more buttons. As we switch from 2D to 3D, we'll get those changes. And it's interesting to see what they thought would be a good addition to a controller to make it better for the end user here. So I just want to ask a question. Do you guys look for anything in a controller, or is it just something where you just pick it up and use it and you don't even think about what you're doing? It's just kind of like an impulse thing at this point.
So it's not an immediate thing, but something that happens after a little while of use is I make sure that it doesn't give my wrists like spasms after using it for like 20 minutes. So I used to use GameCube controllers a lot at my friend's house, and those would always make my hands, like my wrists, spasm from using those.
So you're thinking ergonomics.
Ergonomics, yeah, absolutely.
And you'll see how in the beginning we had something with like boxy corners, and it was it didn't really adapt to the hand, and how nowadays they really focus on how the controllers fit in the hand.
I prefer Xbox controllers just because, for the same reason, it fits my hand really well as opposed to any other controller.
Okay. And yeah, last one.
Kind of like the same experience, but I've got a larger experience range of controllers. I've actually went from like the little Atari game console all the way to a modern, of course. But also experienced like manually shorting the wires to do a controller because I didn't have my controller broke, so I had a paper clip and was doing it. So controllers do dramatically influence the gameplay and the interaction field.
Yeah, and everyone kind of has their own preference because each maker of console has their own like layout, and everyone kind of has found a layout that they enjoy. So we're just going to take a look from the beginning and kind of just see where we started and kind of where we've gone throughout the years. Starting with Pong. Now this wasn't the first video game ever, but it was kind of like the first mainstream one. And Pong kept it pretty simple. It was only one game, so really the controller they needed to make was just for Pong, so that they were kind of focused towards this. So they just made simple knobs that could move your like tennis racket, go up and down, right? Same thing kind of with arcades. In the late 70s, arcades started to take off, and they as well were really purpose-built for the game. So if you had a racing game, they could easily just do a racing wheel and a pedal. If you have something as simple as Pac-Man, you just need the joystick. Dance Dance Revolution created a new type of like way to interact, right? However, with home consoles, you have the issue of having one controller for many types of games. So you have to think about what could we do that would work with like a fighting game, with an action game, with a platformer, and that's kind of like the dilemma that the makers were facing. And so the Atari 2600, which came out in 1977, was kind of the first main game console to like take off, and that introduced like a pretty universal design of the time of just the joystick and the button. And that kind of allowed you could use the button to do stuff like jump, and you could use your joystick to move around, right? Nowadays, you'd probably criticize it just because it was pretty boxy. You don't really see how you can kind of hold a box in your hand. You kind of have to wrap your thumb around to hit the button because your other hand's on the joystick. But back in the day, it kind of did the job. But it could be better, right? This was not better. In an effort to add more buttons, the Atari 5200, they added a number pad below the joystick. Now this presents an issue because you're holding it in one hand, putting your joystick hand on the joystick. How are you supposed to hit these buttons? You kind of have to let go and move your hand down to hit these buttons. The other issue was, it's not like today where they tell you like on the screen what button does what. A lot of games would just come with an overlay that would put a label on the button, but that presents the issue of you have to keep looking down or just memorize these like 10 different controls. Not to mention that the games of the 5200 were basically like the ones we saw in the beginning from the 2600. So you don't even need 10 buttons. You don't even really need 10 buttons nowadays for some games, right? So just overall not that good. And so during this time, there was like an influx of just crappy games and crappy game consoles. And so people kind of started to put doubt on the whole video game thing in general. And that was the video game crash of 1983, which caused people to cast doubts on the future of video game consoles. And it would take something revolutionary to bring back the consumer's trust, and that is the NES. And that revolutionized controllers with the D-pad. And so the D-pad just allowed for very easy movement in all directions while making a more ergonomic design. That this you can actually kind of tell how you would hold it in your hand. There were some complaints about like the sharp corners, but overall this was a pretty good step up from like the Atari 2600. Moving on to the Super Nintendo. This is just kind of like a pretty standard but really good evolution on the Nintendo controller, because you got another set of face buttons, so you kind of have more buttons for something like a fighting game that has more combos and stuff. And you have shoulder buttons at the top, which they add to like the ergonomic feel, because you can keep your hand on the controller and just put your fingers on the triggers and just use those. And as you can see, they rounded it off so that it actually started to, you can see how they kind of started to adapt these controllers to people's hands. However, at this point, we started to enter the 3D age of gaming. And a D-pad at that point just isn't enough to move a character and the camera. So at this point, the makers had to take a pretty big look at how they're going to adapt to this new style that we're more familiar with today. And the first attempt was this, Nintendo 64. I'll give it an A for effort. The idea was it had like 3 prongs, so that if you needed to play a game that just needed a D-pad, you can keep your hands like that. But if you need a control scheme that needs the joystick, you move your hand over to the middle prong. It's just not that comfortable, and not to mention the joystick, it's hard to see at this angle, but it's really thin and like janky to use. As a brand new style of controller, it wasn't terrible. I mean, it did add a trigger to the back so that when you did have your finger on that joystick, you had your index finger on the trigger on the back. And they had the rumble pack, which was pretty cool. Like, your controller can now vibrate in reaction to like these new 3D games. But there's a much better design that I think we're way more familiar with, and that's what the PlayStation brought, which came out in 1995. Now this is actually the DualShock. The original PlayStation 1 controller was the same, but it didn't have the thumbsticks. The DualShock came out 2 years later, but it became like the face of the PlayStation controller. And this gave you built-in rumble, gave you the dual analog sticks, which just nowadays we think is just how it should be. But back in the day, you know, it was up for debate. It also added on clicking down the sticks as an additional input, which was pretty interesting. And just overall, it was just a pretty comfortable controller. You can kind of see, like, nowadays we just put this in our hand and we're ready to go, you know? So as we entered the 6th generation, we kind of got past the early stages of 3D. So the console makers took what they learned and they tried to make it more refined to like be more ergonomic, like you guys said. You want something that's more comfortable. So moving on to the 6th generation, which is kind of where we probably started playing most of our games as kids. We have the original Xbox. Let me introduce you to the Duke. Now, it's kind of hard to, if you know what an Xbox controller is, maybe add like 20% to that. The Xbox controller is already kind of big. This thing was huge, and it was made for us Americans. and it was just uncomfortable. Like the left stick was like went inward, while the right stick was like a half concave, convex type thing. All the buttons were like at a weird angle for no particular reason. Just way too uncomfortable. Huge controller. In Japan though, because Japan always gets the better stuff, they got a way smaller controller called the S controller. And I don't know if any of you guys had an original Xbox, but this is probably the controller you're more familiar with. And even if you look at the Xbox One controller today, this is pretty, it's almost there really. This replaced the garbage Duke and kind of became the face of the Xbox controller today, just with some more refinements. Now I know one of you guys mentioned the GameCube controller, and this is a pretty big step up from the N64 controller, if you remember. Now it does look weird, I will admit. But I guess the comfort is kind of hit or miss, because some people do have comfort issues with it, but a lot of people do think it's comfortable.
Oh, I actually love it. It just has weird.
Yeah, it is a weird kind of feel. It's just, I think it's just something people like have used for so long, they just kind of like got used to it. Because like the idea is they made the A button really big, and then they made the other buttons kind of like orbit around it, which has not really been done since this controller. So you keep your finger on A, and you can just kind of move it up and down if you need to use a different button. And among Smash Brothers players, this is the go-to controller, so much so that every time a new Smash Brothers game comes out, Nintendo continues to make these controllers. And they still fetch a premium today. That's pretty crazy. But moving on to the 7th generation of consoles, they just continue to refine what we know today, right? 7th generation is pretty much where we were, like middle school, high school. This is what we know, right? We've gone from like our one-button joysticks to like the really familiar designs. So at this point, the console makers kind of found what they thought was good, and then now they're just trying to add some more features and stuff to it, right? Except Nintendo, they always change their controller for some reason. And now we have, in my opinion, the best controller ever made, the Xbox 360 controller. I think it's comfortable, it's hefty in the hand, it's solid. The ring design, if you guys don't know, it'll show like what controller you are, or what like number you are around the X in the middle. I thought that was pretty ingenious. It also added wireless as like a standard, which was really nice. However, it did take batteries, which was just not cool. I don't know why it wanted to take batteries. Now, some of you guys may have noticed that I skipped the PS2 controller, and to be honest, it's just because they didn't change anything. It was almost exactly the same as the PS1 controller, and it kind of remained the same. I will say they added wireless in the DualShock 3. It was rechargeable, that was nice, but overall it's basically the same thing. Sony thought they found something that worked, and they kind of stuck with it.
Wait, question. Do you mean the difference between PlayStation 3 controller and PlayStation 2?
Yeah.
Or, oh, okay. I thought you were comparing.
Oh, compared to like the earlier PlayStation controllers,
Oh, it's all three.
Yeah, they're all basically the same.
Okay.
As far as the design goes, they've just kind of like implemented some minor things in them. But as much as it is the same, it's better than this, which is what they first showed us. This was called the Boomerang controller, and I'm not really sure how you're supposed to hold it. I think that whole bottom half is supposed to kind of be under your hands while you move it to the top. I don't know what they were thinking, but honestly I'm glad they kind of kept the old design, because it's way better than this. Now Nintendo, they found a controller that everyone liked, but they said, we don't care, we're going to try something new anyway. And this is the Wii, which I'm sure we're all great fans of, and we love the Wii. You know, it's kind of hit or miss.
Is that sarcasm?
If you're a hardcore gamer, I think everyone can find something great in the Wii. Even if you're a hardcore gamer, there's always something to do with it.
I would agree with you. That's why I was asking if it was sarcasm.
It was kind of half and half,
Okay.
you know. It's a love-hate relationship. It's a love-hate relationship. Because I mean, if you look at it, the Wii was basically a GameCube with motion controls, like the specs and stuff. Even if you hate the Wii, even if you're a hardcore gamer, you can't deny that this definitely revolutionized the way people played with games, and it caught the casual audience, right, with the motion controls. It used an infrared sensor with the Wii sensor bar, and it really just created a whole new genre that we're still trying to figure out today, you know, with like VR and stuff. And this is basically like the main introduction to that to us as consumers. And it was really cool that you could put the Wiimote in different like accessories and stuff to change the way you play the game. In response to this, we have the Kinect and the PS Move. Now the Wii, as some of you might know, ended up being like a very successful console, like the best-selling console of all time. And so Microsoft and Sony were like, hey, we want some of this money too. So what do? Well, Sony basically just rips off the Wii and puts a ball on the top that lights up. Other than that, it's like exactly the same. Kinect tries something different. They put a camera in the sensors of the Kinect, which allowed you to play without any controller. Although I don't know if you guys had a Kinect, I did. It was pretty hit or miss, and the games were also miss. So they tried, and some of you guys might know they pushed it again, and it also failed again. But they made an effort. It was cool for like the year that it was like popping. But now we move on to the current generation, the 8th generation, right? And in this generation, I think, is where they really started to take controllers seriously, because every single console manufacturer like pretty much redid their controller design. And as you guys can see, later on there's going to be some big money thrown into this stuff. Even Sony changed their controller in this one. Let's start with the Wii U. The Wii U decided to make a tablet with controls on the sides of it. Now the concept is pretty cool, and you guys may know that they used it in the future with the Switch. The idea was that you could use the touchscreen to help to create a new way to interact with games as like a secondary screen. For example, in Mario Kart, you no longer have to put the map on the TV because it could just be in your gamepad, or like the positions of the players and stuff. It also had a feature where you could play a game without a TV. Now let's say you have to go into another room or use the bathroom and you want to keep playing your games. You could just turn off the TV and have play on the gamepad. The concept was very interesting, but the main issue it had was just really bad battery life. And I think that's just because they put too much stuff in there. It had like cameras, like TV remote capabilities, all that other stuff. And just to be honest, it was pretty big overall. It's just not really that comfortable to hold. It's heavy and it's just too big. Plus, a lot of games didn't really use the second screen that well. They didn't implement it how like Nintendo, I think, was hoping. And a lot of games, even less than those, didn't even like support the off TV mode. So that's a feature that could be really cool, but it just never got fledged out. And now, that same next year, we had the PS4, which seems to be the winner of this generation. And for the first time, really, since the original DualShock, Sony decided to really change up the entire controller in some pretty good ways. They made the controller way more ergonomic. They added some grips. You can kind of see them at the bottom just to make it more comfortable. Because, I mean, the original ones, the little sticks at the bottom that you hold on to are a little bit too short. They made the thumbsticks a little bit more comfortable. They made the triggers actual like triggers, like in a gun, because before they were just buttons. They added the touchpad, which was a pretty neat idea, although to be honest, most games don't really use it that well either. And just as an aside, Start and Select, rest in peace. This is the first one where they just got rid of them and put share and options. No, nothing. Xbox One. So I'd argue that the Xbox 360 controller, most people enjoyed it, but they were like, we need to improve it. So they spent more than $100 million. It is coming from Microsoft to improve their 360 controller, and yet it still takes batteries. I don't know if they needed a couple more million to fix that issue, but even if you look at it, it basically looks the same. I'm not sure where this money went to. Yeah.
Did they? Because I remember that in the what were they called? The like bird controllers.
The Wavebird?
Wavebird. That's
Yeah.
Nintendo though. Okay.
That was a GameCube one.
GameCube, yeah. But do these ones have like the replaceable rechargeable battery packs? Because I know the Wavebird had a custom.
So the way that the 360 and the One controller works, you could buy like a battery pack, on the 360 it was like an external pack thing, so you could just buy a rechargeable version of that. On this, they embedded the pack into the controller, so it's like a lid with batteries inside, and you could buy a battery pack, but it's just like, why isn't this standard in 2013 when the Wii did it, the PS3 did it, even I'm sure controllers before then, like third-party ones did it, and they spent so much money, yet they couldn't fix the whole battery problem. But yeah, you can buy like packs for it like that, and I guess one argument you can make for it is just like, let's say you have this console for a bunch of years, you know batteries kind of start to deteriorate, so you have the benefit of being able to just put new batteries in, but I'd argue by then the controller is just probably kind of worn out to begin with, so I think people will enjoy rechargeable, and I think they will do rechargeable in the next generation, which we might see at E3 this year. There have been some teasers. The main things they did add with that $100 million is they made the triggers rumble, which was kind of cool because let's say you're playing like a racing game, you can feel like the motor in the triggers. And overall, they added more rumble motors around the controller to make it more detailed. And like I said, it still took batteries to power, but at least they like embedded it into the controller. And rip start and select, and that's now menu and view. I don't know if view even does. It's basically a back button still. So, but yeah, this Xbox One controller, I'd argue the 360 controller is still better. I feel like they just kind of changed it just to change it, but that's just my opinion. Now here's the one that I think deserves some like an award or something. We have the Switch, which has kind of been taken off in the last couple of years. And as always, especially since the Wii U was kind of a failure anyways, they decided to change it up, sort of. I mean, you can kind of see the overall concepts like the Wii U gamepad. And in essence, these Joy-Con, is what they call them, are just basically smaller Wiimotes if you think about it. What's really cool about this though, is that if you remember when I showed you the Pong, that had built-in two-player, and now Nintendo, after all these years, is doing the same type of thing. Because these Joy-Con, you can use them together, or you can split them up, and they have built-in two-player functionality now, which is just really cool because you never have to just worry about bringing another controller, right? They use a gyroscope instead of infrared to offer like better motion control, because I know that was like a hit or miss point of the Wii back in the day. And just like the Wii, depending on the game, they can be vertical or horizontal. And alongside the Xbox, these also have like a high definition rumble, which they claim you can even feel like ice cubes like jiggling around if you like move it around. The main complaints for these though is that they're just really small. I mean, they're like that big. It's really awkward to hold them, but just built-in two-player is really nice. But for you hardcore fans, they made the Pro controller, which basically looks like an Xbox controller to me. Layout's almost identical. But this is nice if you're trying to play more like hardcore game. If you're sitting on your couch, it's just a more comfortable controller. And that's kind of where we are right now. Now, the next generation is coming very soon. Like I said, at E3 this year, we might even see some details about the new Xbox. And but throughout most of this, though, you guys may be wondering, Harbin, don't you know that there's a superior controller choice that has like an infinite amount of buttons? And I'm not a thumbstick scrub like you. I didn't forget about you guys. We got mouse and keyboard. Now, these have remained basically the same. However, as some of you enthusiasts might know, there are different like key switch options and stuff. And the ergonomics are really dependent on the mouse and stuff. You could get one that's for both hands, you can get one that's for right hand. Lefties, they got you covered sometimes, right? And a lot of like PC people swear by mouse and keyboard, and I play PC too. Yeah.
How do you feel about the mouse and keyboards that are the ones that are attached to the consoles? Like I've seen one for the PS4 that's a mouse and keyboard that's kind of oddly shaped.
I haven't seen that. I know back in the day the 360 had like a thing that slotted onto the bottom of it, and I was like really uncomfortable. I haven't seen what you're talking about, but I have heard like games like Fortnite, it's very new, but they're starting to offer mouse and keyboard support, which I think is pretty cool. But as far as those, I'm not sure. I haven't seen that. But I'd imagine it's not like that comfortable if they're all combined into one thing. I'm not sure. Because for mouse and keyboard to really be effective, you need to have it on like a table or something. And as you guys know, the benefits definitely are there. With the keyboard, you're never gonna have to worry about buttons. If you find one control scheme uncomfortable, make it whatever you want it to be, right? And with the mouse, there's always greater precision. If you guys have played first-person shooters, you know that on a mouse, you can just very minutely move your hand, while on a thumbstick, they have to help you so much so that they add like aim assistance things, where they kind of like snap onto heads and stuff. But there are cons to the mouse and keyboard too that I think people kind of overlook. I mean, neither are that ergonomic to use, and I'm pretty sure a lot of us don't even use them correctly if you ask someone who's more experienced in this stuff. And if you really use a mouse a lot, like I know some of the pro gamers for PC, they end up getting like carpal tunnel from using a mouse because it like messes up your wrist. Controllers definitely have ergonomics nailed down more than a mouse and keyboard. For some games though, like racing games, you can't even really use a mouse and keyboard because they don't have analog controls, which means when you press a key on a keyboard, it's either pressed or not pressed. While on like a trigger in a controller, there's variability. You can go a little bit to kind of go, and then if you throw it down, it'll, in a racing game, it'll go really fast. You can't do that in a mouse and keyboard. But that's also another option, and I'm glad that consoles are starting to accept that as an input. Although it might be a little unfair because in first-person shooter games, this is by far the best thing in my opinion. But what's next, you know? As the next generation comes closer to reality, it's going to be interesting to see like the new features that they do. Knowing Sony, maybe it'll just be the same, you know? Knowing Microsoft, they'll probably dump $200 million to add a battery inside the controller. But my hopes are that, because I heard that Microsoft was testing this, that we get something like a smell emitter, you know? That'd be really cool. Imagine if something's like burning in the game and you can smell like a burning smell. And hopefully your controller isn't like just blowing up, you know? Or something cool, you know? Because a lot of these extra features they add, like the Wii U one, like the touchpad, no one uses them in the games. No one implements them. So I think they should add something that's a little bit more like easier to implement, kind of, you know, if they make it easier to like for the game developers like us to put that in the game, and just make it something where it doesn't require a bunch of like new stuff to learn. That's definitely like a smell emitter, something the player doesn't even have to worry about, aside from their controller maybe like blowing up or something, right? But we'll see, you know, E3 this year, hopefully Microsoft shows us what they're working on, and Sony's supposed to be next year. We'll see what happens. But yeah, that's kind of where we've gone. We've gone from something as simple as a button and a joystick, right, or two knobs. And now we have so many different buttons on a controller, and yet we still can today pick up a controller and we just know how to use it. We never have to look down. That's pretty crazy how they made it so that there's so many different inputs, but you just pick it up and you're ready to go. And hopefully in the future we can get some crazy stuff on top of that. And references are provided if you need references. It's all, the presentation is linked in the discussion if you guys want to take a look. But yeah, that's the end of the slide.